Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello. My name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 120. In this episode today, we will cover a collection of poems, almost all of them love poems that, and I quote, philosophize, celebrate, attack, plead, and express pain, longing, and despair, all in a tone of voice that rarely rises above a reflective murmur, all spoken as if in an inner monologue or dialogue, and all within the tight structure of the English sonnet form, close quote, which that was according to Barbara Mowat and Paul Werstein, editors of the Folger Shakespeare Library editions. Now, I will preface our conversation today by saying up front that I am not a quote-unquote poetry guy. I don't know poetry. I think the greatest poetry probably ever written was the rhyming poetry of Ogden Nash. Dr. Seuss drives my kids crazy, and those are the only poems that I remember. So I am not a poetry guy. I am a prose fellow. And by the way, we're going to be recording an entire episode on Tennyson coming up here in a few months, and I'm already working my way through that. But I do recognize poetry as a literary form, and I think we have to talk about poetry as a literary form, but also as a form that can impact leadership. Now, when I think about these poems, I was supposed to read them in high school, and I assiduously avoided it at all costs. As a matter of fact, part of the collection of this author's works had all the sonnets in the work, and it was a giant white book that was as thick as a Bible. And I literally read everything else other than that, and then I put it away back on the shelf. And that is a perfect example, my approach to this content, at least in the past, up until this point, is the perfect example of what I talk about in the opening to all of our episodes, where I state that we are reading books and plays and poems that you fell asleep trying to read in high school. Perfect example of this. But, and Muhammad Ali, I think, made this point years ago, although he might have ripped it off from somebody else. If you are the same person 30 years later that you were in high school, you probably haven't grown at all. And by the way, I'm coming to this podcast recording today, having watched both 21 Jump Street, the movie, and 22 Jump Street, the sequel, with Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum. So I've got that floating around in my head as well. And don't worry, this podcast episode, while it may need more Tatum, isn't going to get any Tatum beyond what I'm going to mention here. The point of this podcast is to push me, and you, of course, to be open to other content that may not traditionally be considered to be quote-unquote classic literature. And this collection of poems, and how we talk about this collection of poems, is going to do that today. Leaders, push yourself into different genres and into different areas and grow as a leader. Now, to help us wrap our brains around all of this, and we've already heard her chuckling along as I have been doing my open here, my cold open, such as it were, to help us wrap our brains around this content and help us think about this in an interesting kind of way, we have invited back to this podcast our guest from episode number 112, where we dissected, or barely began to dissect, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, Christen Horne.
Hello.
Back to the podcast, Kristen. How are you doing?
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
Yes.
I'm like kind of the complete opposite. Not complete opposite. Sorry. I definitely fell asleep reading some of these books in high school.
Hmm. We
Um,
all did.
I loved the poems though. Like, and I actually got my start in writing
Hmm.
as a poet. Like I won
Oh,
like even like
okay.
I think I was like in fourth grade, fifth grade, something like that. I won like a little prize, like a little local prize for a poem that I submitted to a competition. And so I was just like, it's funny now to be coming back around and being like, oh, I love poetry. I don't like a lot of modern poetry because I'm like, I don't think that's a poem. Like just because you spaced it out funny on the page, I don't. Is that what makes it a poem? I don't know. I think that might even be offensive to say or ask. So, but I love the old stuff. My brother for my birthday bought me like a stack of poetry books that I had asked for. Um, so I loved going through these. And in high school, just to like kind of
Yeah,
actually
no, go
wrap
ahead.
that back,
Yeah.
um, it was like Sonnet 90 just rocked my world. And when I got back around to it after reading
Hmm.
it for this podcast, I was like,
Hmm.
this is still a banger. This is still my favorite song. So I'm thrilled. I love poetry. It's like I can't wait. Can't wait.
Well, maybe I should bring you back for the poetry episode. Like I said, we are going to be covering Tennyson with another co-host. And he is a poetry guy, weirdly enough. But he also writes prose. So he's kind of
Yeah.
multi-talented
Well,
in kind of
and
all those spaces.
that's one of the reasons I started getting back into it. Is I don't know if I can consider myself a poetry person yet because like I'm not very well read on it yet. I'm
Okay.
getting back into it. But I started getting back into it on the advice of like he's a fantasy author and he just writes and writes and writes and writes. Prolific. That's the word I was looking for. And he's like, before I write every day, I read poetry because it helps make your prose better.
Hmm.
And I was like, what? That's amazing. I already love poetry and it's going to make my writing better. Okay. Deal. So,
Well, and I shouldn't, and we'll get into the sonnets here in just a second. Um, I should probably like it more. I mean, like I remember lyrics to like songs, and
yeah.
songs and poetry are pretty basically the same thing. It's just set to music, right?
Right.
I get it, right? I remember rap lyrics from the early '90s when I was bumping to whatever degenerate rap music I was bumping to in the early '90s. Um, and so I remember those kinds of things. I remember a rhyming structure. Um, but there's something about it sitting on the page. It doesn't, up until this point, and honestly, I'll be honest, like the even how I consumed this, I'll talk about a little bit about that here when we get into like the literary life of William Shakespeare a little bit. But like how even I consumed this, I needed to put it into a bucket where I could relate to it. And the bucket that I relate to it on, and this is probably a negative on my part, is not just reading it on the page. It lays flat for me because I'm like, okay, what are we doing here? How are we doing this? It has to sort of be lived in order for me to wrap my arms around it. And I'm still carrying that from high school. So I should probably let that go. I should probably let that go. I should probably be the bigger man or whatever. I don't know, older man. I did post on my Facebook page one time. Yes, I am on Facebook. If you want to go follow me, that's fine or not. You don't have to. But I did post one time that I'm growing old, but not gracefully. All right. Let's kick it off with the Sonnets by William Shakespeare. We're going to read directly from Sonnet 2. Now, for most of these sonnets, and I'll just tell you this for you who are listening today, these sonnets are mostly short, right? And so you can go get an audio version of the sonnets by William Shakespeare. And they're not long, they're not laborious pieces, right? But they are meaningful, and they do sit, as I stated in the introduction there, they do sit inside of an English literary tradition of short form poetry, particularly short form love poetry, we'll talk about here in just a moment. All right, Sonnet 2 by William Shakespeare. I'm going to go down to a murmur here in a moment. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, Thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. Then being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, to say within thine own deep sunken eyes were an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse, proving his beauty by succession thine. This were to be new made when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feelest cold. I think I did a pretty good job there reading that, actually.
You did. I was, yeah.
I'm gonna pat
It's
myself
like,
on the
oh,
back.
I
I mean, I'm
hope he
not
doesn't
Patrick
ask me to
Stewart.
read this yet.
I'm not that guy, but I think I did okay. The literary life of William Shakespeare. Let's talk a little bit about this, because we've talked about Shakespeare before, and this episode sort of wraps up our month of Shakespeare. We did not get to Macbeth this year. We'll bump him to next year, but there we as usual have access the Folger Shakespeare Library, which you can get online at folger.edu, the largest sort of public domain available repository of Shakespeare and writing about Shakespeare and analysis of Shakespeare, probably on the internet. And it's a great resource for the podcast, and we'll have links in the show notes to where you can go and grab all of that. But from the Folger Shakespeare Library Edition's Introduction to Shakespeare Sonnets by Barbara Mowat and Paul Werstein, I'm going to quote directly again, because it sort of lays the foundation for what we're talking about here today. And I quote, "Yet it is not just the beauty and power of individual well-known sonnets that tantalize us, but also the story that the sequence as a whole seems to tell about Shakespeare's love life. The 154 sonnets were published in 1609 with an enigmatic dedication, presumably from the publisher Thomas Thorpe," end quote, "to the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H. Attempts to identify Mr. W.H. have become inevitably entangled with the narrative that insists on emerging whenever one reads the sonnets sequentially as they are ordered in the 1609 quarto. The narrative goes something like this. The poet, i.e. William Shakespeare, begins with a set of 17 sonnets advising a beautiful young man, seemingly an aristocrat, perhaps Mr. W.H. himself, to marry and produce a child in the interest of preserving the family name and property, but even more in the interest of reproducing the young man's remarkable beauty in his offspring. These poems of advice modulate into a set of sonnets which urge the poet's love for the young man and which claim that the young man's beauty will be preserved in the very poems that we are now reading. The second set of sonnets, sonnets 18 to 126, which in the supposed narrative celebrate the poet's love for the young man, includes clusters of poems that seem to tell of specific events, as the young man's mistreatment of the poet, the young man's theft of the poet's mistress, the appearance of quote-unquote rival poets who celebrate the young man and gain his favor, the poet's separation from the young man through travel or through the young man's indifference, and the poet's infidelity to the young man. After this set of 109 poems, the sonnets concludes with a third set of 28 sonnets to or about a woman who is presented as dark and treacherous, and with whom the poet is sexually obsessed. Several of these sonnets seem also to invoke or involve the beautiful young man who is, according to the sonnet's narrative, also enthralled by the quote-unquote dark lady. Close quote. So that gives us a little bit of idea of what we're doing here. There is a narrative structure to the way these sonnets are put together and that the way they have been collected and even the way they've been read and consumed over the last now 400 and what 417 years, give or take a few years here or there. And so this is why I wanted to get Christen on, because Kristen's a big fan of poetry. I did not know she was an award-winning.
Oh gosh, poet. I was like I said, 5th grade, man. So
well, you've made more money from poetry. Look, you made more money from poetry than I ever have. So you're award-winning to me. You're award-winning to the audience of
an
one.
Award-winning poet. I'll make sure to put that in our little bio when we publish our novel.
There you go.
Award-winning poet.
That's right. Hey, look, I put on my LinkedIn profile I'm a 3-time least selling author ever. I've sold the least books of any author you know. We all have to stand on our accolades somewhere. Otherwise, no one else will talk about them.
Yeah. Right.
So talk to us about the impact and the importance of the sonnets on you and your life and your creativity. Let's start with there, Kristen.
Yeah. Sonnet 90, I think, like I said earlier, was the
Mhm.
first one to really like stand out to me, especially in high school. I was pretty depressed, but I was a high functioning depressed
Mhm.
person. So nobody blinked an eye. I was fine. I had straight A's, was well adjusted. Everything was fine. Inside I was dying. And so when I found Sonnet 90, I was like, somebody understands me. And
Oh, by the way,
there's
do you want to read Sonnet 90 so we get a
Oh, I guess I
full,
could. Yeah, you know what? Let me
you
see.
know, what the heck?
Sonnet
Why not? I mean, it's
90.
yeah, we're breaking the format of the podcast. It's fine.
Sonnet 90.
Of
Okay.
course,
I did not practice this, so I
that's okay.
apologize.
I
I am
read it
also
cold.
not Patrick Stewart.
Listen, Kristen, I read it cold. You'll be fine.
Okay. Okay. So this one. Um, then hate me when thou wilt, if ever now. Now while the world is bent my deeds to cross, join with the spite of fortune, make me bow, and do not drop in for an after loss. Ah, do not, when my heart hath scaped this sorrow, come in the rearward of a conquered woe. Give not a windy night a rainy morrow, to linger out a purposed overthrow. If thou wilt leave me, do not leave me last. When other petty griefs have done their spite, but in the onset come, so shall I taste. At first the very worst of fortune's might, and other strains of woe, which now seem woe, compared with loss of thee, will not seem so. And there's like, for me, there's like this ringing sensation all throughout that was just was my existence in high
Mhm.
school.
Yeah.
And as like influence on like my life and my creativity, there was something bright, like you know, remember Inside Out with those core memories.
Oh yeah.
That's like a
Hmm.
boom, very
Yeah.
bright blue core memory for me. Um, and it was like it was almost an anchor point. It
Hmm.
was like, okay, someone understands. That was really important to me. It is still really important to me. It's like this idea of understanding.
Yeah.
Um, and and I didn't like think this cognizantly at the time, but like, and what I am feeling can be expressed,
Hmm.
which as an artist is very
Yeah. It's
important.
very important. Yeah.
Um, so that was just that was the core. That was the
Hmm.
core for me. Back in high school when I was, you know, falling asleep at like what is it, the Scarlet Letter. I was just like,
Yeah. Or
but then, you
persuasion
know,
or
that one,
something.
yeah, right. But this just like it felt like it leapt off the page
Hmm.
at me. And you know, you mentioned about like how you consumed the sonnets. Like
Yeah.
even me, I'm not practiced at reading Shakespeare anymore, so I had to listen and read at the same time, and I still had to listen to some of them multiple times before I was like, okay, I think maybe I understand, maybe. And some of them still, I'm just like, I don't get this one.
Yeah.
But for my creativity, oh, I can't remember if we were recording when I mentioned this. The author that recommended reading poetry before writing, I
Hmm.
definitely felt like as I was just like immersing myself in these sonnets, I could feel it almost like almost what was it, like one of those big puzzles? Not
Hmm.
really the Rubik's Cube sort of thing, but you could
Hmm.
just almost feel your brain like clicking, clacking, and shifting. And I was
Hmm.
like, this is so cool. I can't wait to do more poetry.
That's awesome.
And now when I go through and I'm editing, because right, we're in the middle of like heavy rewrites for our
Yeah.
books. I'm going through and I'm like, oh, we don't need that. Delete that.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't need that. Delete that. Oh gosh, this is delete that. Delete that. All of a sudden I'm seeing my writing in a complete almost in a completely with completely different eyes. And it wasn't
Hmm.
that long ago that I was writing them. So normally it takes much longer.
Hmm.
You know, people say like put it away, like even freaking Stephen King, he's like, yeah, just put it away
Yeah.
until it looks like a brand new book you've never seen it before.
Yeah.
We're still working on getting published, so I'm like, I don't have time to do that.
Yeah. 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 I gotta
So
get paid here,
but
Stephen.
immersing, yeah, right. So but it's weird that like immersing myself in these sonnets almost seems to have accelerated that
Hmm.
happening because now I'm just like oh, I'm looking at it with a completely different perspective. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, that's not as effective as I thought it was going to be. Okay, delete that, or like switch this over here. And it's just like, it's so cool. It's so much fun.
Well, and it's interesting because neurologically speaking, the way our brains work, and again, this is something that I've learned over the last 30 years, the way our brains work around things that are prose based, narrative structures, versus something that's more rhythmical or lyrical, it
Hmm.
activates two different parts of our brains. That's
Hmm.
one thing I do understand now. So I understand why. I mean, I understand why I remember song lyrics versus remembering maybe the entire opening anymore to the Gettysburg Address. Although I do kind of remember chunks of that, right? Because it activates a different story center in your head,
Hmm.
right? Which is what you're talking about as a writer. But also, it's interesting how the structure, and I noticed this with all of the sonnets actually, the structure of them is here's our setup, there's a weird sort of muddy middle, and then there's a stinger at the end.
Oh my gosh. I can't tell you how many couplets I wrote down. And I was like, okay, this couplet is amazing. Oh, this couplet is amazing. I just wrote them all down on my phone. I was like, these are so cool.
Yeah, and I am fascinated by the idea that number one, we know a bit about Shakespeare, but we don't know as much as we would like to know. Why we don't know as much as we would like to know in a sort of a postmodern, I got to know everything about you all the way down to your bottom of your psychology kind of thing. Like we don't know anything about Shakespeare, that kind of way. And by the way, that's good. That was actually probably one of the better things that he did, other than dying. Not one of the better things that he did, you know. Because what it does is it creates mystery, and then you can fill that bucket with whoever or whatever you want it to be. But there's clearly a mind back there, not only behind the plays, obviously, but behind the sonnets, most particularly, that understands something about couplet structure that is very, very sophisticated and
Hmm.
is very, very demanding. And it's almost as if, and I look at it, of course, I look at it through a martial arts lens because, of course, why not? But also through a business lens or an entrepreneurship lens, where once you get to a certain point, you've seen enough and you've been through enough to where you can now begin shaving away the excess.
Hmm.
And that's what he did in his sonnets, apparently. He shaved away the excess. Um, and, really good poetry writers will eventually wind up in a space of a haiku where, and I don't understand the haiku structure at all. It doesn't rhyme at the end. And so I'm like, frustrated. But, you're going to have like, what is it? What is the high school haiku structure? It's like 3 words and then 6 words
It's
and then
syllables. I believe it's
syllables.
575.
575. Okay. All right. I'll take your word for it. You go ahead and Google it and look it up while I'm
Just to
rambling.
make sure.
Yeah. While I'm rambling and going,
575. Yeah.
575. Okay, cool.
3 lines, five
Three.
syllables, seven syllables, 5 syllables. Yep.
Right. So I look at that and I look at that as like, okay, that's a Japanese sword master kind of deal where
Hmm.
like you're killing somebody just by slicing an ear off and they like fall down. I'm looking at it like that.
Ah.
Whereas Shakespeare is more like medieval. I'm going to hit you with a bunch of things, but it's going to be the right things in the right area. It's a fundamentally
Hmm.
European versus a fundamentally sort of Asian sort of approach to lyrical structure.
I don't know if anybody like y'all watched the Shogun
I have
show.
heard immense things about it, but I refuse to get Hulu because I'm not bundling anything for Disney.
That's fair. That's fair. But
I
oh,
might rip it off.
it's
I might
so
ride the
good.
pirate waves.
It's
Maybe.
so good. I mean, we all knew that was coming back, like
Yeah.
as soon as yeah.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of episodes that start to really focus in and zoom in on the poetry, and
Hmm.
it's just amazing. Even
Yeah.
and I don't pretend to fully understand Japanese poetry.
Yeah.
I think the haiku is also supposed to. This is not like everybody's like, oh, haiku 575. It's also supposed to have something to do with a season. Like
Oh, okay.
that's like an underlying a true haiku
Hmm.
has like a seasonal reference or something. And it was like, oh, I
Hmm.
never knew that.
Hmm. Well, and that's interesting, particularly for this podcast because we do focus on the idea, and we'll get to it at the end of this episode as well. We try to focus on solutions to problems at the end of the fourth turning, which I fundamentally believe that we're at the end of that. We're in the last bit of chaotic winter before spring shows
Mhm.
up in the West again. And leaders have to. I think that leaders need to be tied in more to the cyclical and the lyrical versus, and we'll talk a little bit about this today with the ideas of romantic love, which of course lay underneath the sonnets. But I do think that leaders have to be tied into the cyclical and the lyrical in a deeper level than they really are, right? Because leaders are very much tied into the mechanistic, and that really sort of happens with capitalism and making money and sort of figuring all of that out. But there's a whole other unexplored world that exists underneath there that if you're ignorant to it, I do believe that there are dragons that can come out of that water and eat you, and you won't have any defense for a mechanistic mind has zero defense against something that's cyclical and lyrical, and is fundamentally sort of confused when it shows up, and then everything falls into chaos, and you know the
As you're
systems get
talking,
calcified.
what came to mind was being reactive versus zooming out and understanding that there's a big arc,
Right. Yep.
right?
Yeah. Well, and even so, when I look at the sonnets are written in a Shakespeare is sticking to a particular structure.
Mhm.
Now he's doing art inside that structure. He's peeling away, like we just said, he's peeling away the meaning inside of that structure, but he is inside some boundaries, right? Now I do think it would have been interesting, and this is one of the sort of mind games that I do sometimes when I read stuff like this. What would it have been like if he had been able to travel to Japan and read a haiku? Like, how would that have blown his mind,
Right.
right? Or what if a great haiku master from Japan had been able to go to England and be able to access sonnets,
Mhm.
in the 17th century? How would that have blown his mind?
Right.
And that's what you're getting with the internet right now, is all this cross pollination of
Yeah.
ideas,
Yeah.
and that's why it feels like a chaotic mess a little bit, because we're coming up with new forms. All right. By the way, why don't you tell the story of how you sort of consumed this with
Oh
not
yeah.
that, but yeah, tell a little bit about that and a little bit about the Patrick Stewart piece, because I think people want to hear about that, because
Yeah.
they're like, what was that reference?
So so if you decide you want to read the sonnets, don't feel bad if you can't just sit down and read the book, because I couldn't. I'm out of practice reading Shakespeare, and so I knew that in order to get through these in time for the podcast, I was going to have to listen and read them at the same time. And thankfully now, like, audiobooks are like they're everywhere. So I was like, sure, surely there will be an audiobook. But I actually feel like I found something better. So during the COVID lockdown, Sir Patrick Stewart read a sonnet a day, and that playlist is on YouTube. You can go find it. Just put Sir Patrick Stewart sonnets.
There you go.
And it's amazing. And don't get frumpy. I will tell you right now, frumpy. Sorry, that's a word that I use all the time. There are sonnets that he just skips, and I was very irritated about that. But then, like, sometimes he'll start a video and he'll be like, I'm sorry, I have to apologize. I'm going to skip that one because I don't like it. I find it rather offensive, and no one's going to make me read it. It's like, okay. And so there's a handful that he just doesn't read. I think in like the 70s or so, he just skips like four.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay. So you'll have to go find someone else to read that. There was another playlist. I don't remember what it's called, but it looks really bad because it's a video of someone pushing a tablet to like pull up someone else reading the sonnet. But
Okay.
those are actually amazing reads.
Okay.
Those are amazing reads. So whenever Patrick Stewart just skips a sonnet, go see if you
Mm-hmm.
can find that playlist, because some of those are better. Like,
Nope. Nope. Nope.
I
Nope.
know.
Nope. That was sacrilegious. Nope.
I know. Uh, so
Well, we all can't be we all can't. I mean, Captain Picard can't hit
I know,
Professor
right?
Xavier can't hit
Yeah,
all the he can't hit all the
yeah,
marks, so it's fine.
yeah. Well,
It's fine.
also, he's preparing them in like an hour. and casually. So it's just like it's all good.
Right.
When you listen to the one that he has memorized, you're like, oh, this is a completely different level.
Right,
Um,
because it's actually embedded into his
yeah, yeah,
soul, such as it
yeah,
were, his psyche. Okay,
yeah.
awesome.
And then Ian McKellen makes a surprise appearance for Sir Patrick Stewart's birthday, which is just like, oh, we're all benefiting from this. Is amazing.
Gandalf came.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's
Awesome.
it's a great playlist.
Excellent. Well, we will be sure to put the link to that in the show notes underneath the player for this episode. So go click on that link and listen to that playlist. Back to the sonnets. Back to the Folger Shakespeare Library translation or version or publication of the sonnets by William Shakespeare. I'm going to put my NPR voice on now as we read Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou'st. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Um, Now I'm not Pablo Neruda, although I do have a book of Pablo Neruda's love poems floating around somewhere in my house. Um, and I've been married a while now. I won't get into the specific number of years, but I've been married a while now. And when you've been married a while, shall I compare thee to a summer's day takes on different kinds of meaning than when you're first in the throes of a relationship when you're like 18 or 25 or 40. So while I'm not going to get into that aspect of this,
Huh.
because this sonnet has been often quoted in romantic in a romantic context, right? For romantic novels, romantic films, the kinds of movies you see, like that silly movie Serendipity back in the day, a movie I hate, but where we meet each other, we're gonna fall in love, and then there's gonna be this tragic middle thing that happens, and then the denouement, everybody gets together, and she loves him, and he loves her, and yada yada yada. Okay, we've seen the structure before, right? I'm not dismissing it. There's relevance for romance. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk a lot about romance today, um, in philosophical, moral, and even leadership terms, because there is a role for romance, I believe, for leaders. And no, it does not mean having romance with the people that you work with. I would strongly reject putting the line, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, in any communication that you're having with your team members or employees. And don't tell them that they are more lovely and more temperate. Don't do that part either. However, reading this and understanding what we talk about when we talk about love has to begin with an understanding of sort of where Shakespeare was coming from in medieval times, right? Or, well, not even medieval, post-medieval times, in that weird moment that happened between the end of the medieval era in Europe, historically speaking, and the beginning of the Renaissance. There's the low Renaissance and there's the high Renaissance, and high Renaissance is what everybody thinks of, like Michelangelo and David and Raphael and the great paintings. That was the high Renaissance, which was also a time, by the way, of Martin Luther and Christopher Columbus. Everybody forgets that. And so a lot of dynamics were happening in Europe all at the same time and globally, right? But Shakespeare was writing in that weird middle moment where the transition was being made. And in medieval times, from the 13th and 14th century up to Shakespeare's day, love was considered to be a secondary or even tertiary or minor consideration when it came to marriage. As a matter of fact, romantic love is a driver for marriage, and you can Google this and research all this yourself. And lifetime partnering really didn't start until in full force until around the 18th century. As a matter of fact, it became industrialized during the 20th century and led into all the kinds of current issues and challenges that we have right now, which we'll talk about some of those today. So Shakespeare was sitting in a weird cultural shift that was happening where the medievals, who were concerned, quite frankly, about business arrangements and property, where the status of women, and by the way, feminism was not a thing, okay, in the 13th and 14th century, where the status of women as property and women, not being able to hold property was in direct contradiction and was in direct challenge to Christian ideals of egalitarianism that were also ruling Europe throughout the medieval period. And of course, were influencing Shakespeare. And so this idea that you would marry for love, this idea that a woman was more than just a piece of property, she was a romantic object with her own, yes, a romantic object, I did use that term, with her own ideals and her own emotions and her own needs to be fulfilled, right? And here's another practical consideration that was going in, that was also being considered in Shakespeare's time, that somehow romantic love would act as I'm going to use a challenging word here, an ameliorative barrier, right, to the very real challenges of infant mortality, disease, poverty, and death. I mean, when Shakespeare was writing in the early 17th century, a quarter of Europe's population, a little more than a quarter of Europe's population, had been carried off by the Black Death in the previous 150 years. And so that wasn't something that was sort of a back of the mind consideration. It was still very real. He was surrounded by people who had actually had relatives that had, died of the bubonic plague, and they weren't kidding.
I think one of the sonnets even mentions like a common cure or like
Yep.
something for the plague. So
Correct. Right. And then you put all this in the milieu of Western Europe, where they are in the hangover from Roman and Greek paganism, right? So the Roman and Greek ideals of love, and of platonic love versus romantic love versus agape love, which is the love that Jesus talks about in the New Testament. These ideals, while they were supposed to be spread throughout the throughout the medieval world, by monks and priests and Catholic, yes, Catholic folks, it had sort of gotten into being more of a business, which is how all systems eventually run to. It had sort of gotten into being more of a business of religion in Western Europe and in England at the time, which was in contrast or in tension with the actual religious practice of religion. So people were getting married for a whole bunch of different reasons, just like now. People had a whole bunch of numerous cultural challenges around marriage and mating, just like now. But romantic love was not the primary driver. And then Shakespeare dumps sonnets like this into the culture, indicating that a sea change is beginning to occur.
a key change, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry.
Well, let's start there. So, why is love a powerful motivator for people to engage in romance? And I'm fascinated by the idea that marriage used to be more of a business arrangement and you went and got your love someplace else. Like your marriage was not the
Right,
place
that was just
that
okay.
Yeah, that was fine. Like
right?
nobody cracked it. The only people who couldn't afford to do that, by the way, were the medieval peasants who had no money and no access, right? But which by the way, if we had all lived during medieval times, I want to just, even the people who are listening here, let's just be real. Without industrialization, all of us would have been medieval peasants. We would have been living on lands of feudal lords, regardless of race or gender, whatever. We would have been living on lands of feudal lords and working those lands and dying in wars. The Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, all those things mattered. Free speech, the Constitution, the Declaration of all those kind of, the Magna Carta, which was getting ready to come up, all that kind of stuff matters to get us to where we are at now. It didn't just sort of pop out of the woodwork. and it's not guaranteed, by the way, to last. Okay, so we have to like actually hold on to that stuff, because you could easily, the default for humanity is service for somebody else, because the default is slavery, and you just live and work and die. And if you fall in love, well, that's nice, I guess, maybe, but no one cares. That's the default. So having romantic love is great. I'm fascinated by the idea of it. Again, you get your partnerships, you get your romantic love over there someplace else. And I'm going to bring up an article that I just saw the headline for in the Atlantic, like literally before I came on this podcast, that I want to bring up to this. But it's interesting that as we are arcing through the early part of the 21st century, we're now talking about the difficulties of romantic attachment. Fertility is down everywhere across the West. Replacement weights are down all the way across the West. And because of our technology now, almost no one can hook up. Although everybody can hook up. Everybody can hook up to do everything. But almost no one can engage in romantic love. But everybody still wants that. We're in this weird conundrum, just like in Shakespeare's time. And so that's what I connected with on this. Thoughts that you may have. Thoughts, ideas, you're brimming over. I'm done.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's funny because Hasan sends me the kind of the guideline for the podcast, and it's like, why is love such a powerful motivator? It's like, we don't have time. There is not enough time to talk about this.
We've only got an hour.
Yeah, right. I think people have written their dissertations on this, and just written.
Yeah, it's fine.
Anyway, so but I want to point out something. This might feel like nitpicking, but just almost breaking down this question. Love is different from romance.
Okay.
Right. So that's how the question's written. Why is love such a powerful motivator for people to engage in romance? So people, I think, get confused, and they expect love to be and feel like romance. And that causes a lot of pain and strife in relationships when you go into a romantic relationship and then you're in it for long enough that the romance, it doesn't, you have to actively keep it up. I think that's what shorter lived relationships don't understand. That has to continue to be an intention. You have to set it, your husband, whatever, you have to work at that, because otherwise you fall into a rhythm and then the relationship goes stale. That's just kind of how life goes. So you could apply that to kind of everything. But love, one of my favorite shows used to be Doctor Who. I love the old seasons. Please don't find me and send me hate mail. I can't stand the new seasons. The writing is just atrocious. But back when they first revived it, you've got Christopher Eccleston, you've got David Tennant, Matt Smith was not my favorite, but whatever, it's fine. Peter Capaldi gets in there for a couple of seasons, and I still didn't love those seasons. Capaldi was an amazing doctor. But anyway, all that to say, there's this punchline at the end of one of his seasons, and it's absolutely amazing. And he says, love is not a feeling. Love is a promise. And that just boom. It was like, oh my gosh, that's the talk about a compact way of expressing something that I feel like I've always known. So love, but back to the actual question.
Sure. Yeah. It's okay. Love is a many splendored thing. We're going to talk about that too.
Because why is love such a powerful motivator? Because we know, I think all instinctively, we all know how powerful love is. True, deep, crazy love. It's, I'm Catholic, so I believe love doesn't end. Love, it really is, God is love.
Right.
It is everywhere. It permeates all things. It is all powerful. So is there a better motivator? I don't know. It's divine.
Well,
then engaging in romance, I think we almost think that romance is love.
Right.
Romance is not love. We have two different words for it for a reason.
Well, and I think what the other thing and maybe you can address this as well, the English language has only one word for love.
But yes, love. That too.
And so...
And love is multifaceted. It's it's way more than just physical attraction.
Right. like I mean, I've talked about my kids on the podcast. Okay, I'm not going to talk about them. Like I have friends. I do actually. I have people that hang around me and like to hang around me, and I like to hang around them. I know it's shocking, but like yeah, but I will use the term love. I love hanging out with this guy, right? Or
Yeah.
um, I love doing this particular thing with this particular person, right? But then we'll also use that same term to make it about business and leadership for just a minute. I love doing I love standing up on stage, right? Or I
Yeah.
love talking with my employees, right? Or I love starting a new project, or I love feeling as though I'm being recognized for my unique gifts and talents and skills and competencies, right? We're using that word love, but the context changes the container that that word sits in, but it's still just one word.
Right.
And it's this one word covering a multitude of sins in the English language. Now, in other languages, in other language groups, in other language forms, love, that word is split up, as I believe it probably should be in English, because, you talk about the difference between romance and love. Romance is much more, to me, much more of an intentional act.
Mhm.
And that gets me into trouble a little bit sometimes, but it's an intention. Well, it does because you have to put some. People want romance to be spontaneous, and
Uh,
and 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 um that's not the reality of life. The reality of life is that I'm busy, you're busy, everybody's busy. And to your point, if you don't work on romance, by the way, the work implies intention,
uh-huh.
you're not going to get the thing you want to get on the other side of romance, which is deep, meaningful, physical, spiritual, material, emotional connection. You're not going to get that. You're going to get a big fat zero. So you have to be intentional, which you have to put in work, which romance does have an element of work to it. It has an element of intentionality. Now, it also has elements of, and I would be remiss if I did not admit this, it does have moments of spontaneity for sure. But just like Dennis Leary said in his great comedy album in the 1990s, No Cure for Cancer, you eat the chocolate and you feel good for like 5 seconds. Or you have the orgasm and you feel good for 5 seconds, right? Like these things happen for 5 seconds and then you're back to your crappy life. Like that's it. Like you're back to the thing that you're always doing. And the spontaneity and romance happens and then you're back to talking about like, when are we going to how are we going to deal with the grocery list this week? Because those things also matter, right? So I think the struggle in the West has been and it's been a 500-year long struggle. And I don't think we're out of it yet. I think we're deep, and technology just made this worse. But the 500-year long struggle in the West is how to have both those things at the same time between two people.
Hmm.
And none of us knows the answer. Nobody knows the answer. We're all just like blind people groping around trying to figure it out in the dark. We don't know. We have no idea. Like I'll stand in line. I'll use a Louis C.K. example, right? I'm standing in line in the grocery store. This has actually happened to me. And I'm just watching people's marriages fall apart,
Oof.
just all over the place. And it's not for lack of romance. It's not even for lack of love. I think the two people probably do love each other. I have to presume the best motives for everybody. But like he's on his phone and the kid's screaming and she's staring, 10,000 yard stare like she's got PTSD like a Vietnam vet. And like just what's happening there? That's a relationship that's like the sound that it's making is it's disintegrating. And if you go and ask either one of those two people, they will intertwine the words love and romance together.
Mm.
If you ask them honestly. And so this is the thing I think we're struggling with. And this is what the ideal is what Shakespeare delivers to us. He delivers us the ideal from the top of the mountain.
Hmm. Interesting.
I thought it had some legs. It was a thesis. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It's my my thoughts about that was that reading through especially all the ones that were about the beautiful young man,
Hmm.
is it felt like they were poems about a love, about someone he couldn't have.
Right.
But to your point, that might be that might be what that might be the point you're making. It's like,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
Shakespeare's delivering the ideal. None of us can have it. It doesn't really exist. We just can't. Like, we can't get there.
Well, and the ideal will judge you because that's what an ideal does. Like it judges you, and you're always found wanting. You are always wanting in comparison to the ideal. You're never meeting the ideal. You're never meeting your potential. Not happening. Like, for instance, here's an ideal. I live in a community where the average age of the individuals in the community is 55 to 75.
Mm.
Okay. A lot of retirees, a lot of folks who are on the downhill side of life. As a matter of fact, I just went to a barbecue this weekend that had like 6 couples there. And my wife and I, who are in our mid 40s, were the youngest couple there with our 2 children who are 7 and 14. And they were all fascinated by the 7-year-old, and he put on a good show and he did his job. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. And my 14-year-old, she put on a show. She did her good job. She's starting to understand like the social stuff, like how that works. She's 14, so like it's sort of starting to begin to happen, right? Right on time, by the way, developmentally. But we were the youngest people there. And it's just fascinating to watch these, 4 other couples or 6 other couples who have been married. One woman said, I've been married to this man for 45 years. I've already heard this story. And I was just like, okay, that's all right. All right. and it's, and you still have romance after 45 years. 45 years with the same person. This is what we struggle with in the West.
Was that a question? Can you have romance?
Is a question. It is absolutely a question. This is the question that all the Gen Zers who are between the ages of 25 and 35 now are asking, and they don't believe the answer is yes. This is the question that all the millennials, who the oldest of them are now 44, are struggling with. This is the question that all the boomers, many of whom worked on their or on their second marriage, just hanging on for dear life, and the Gen Xers who are on their second marriage, hanging on for dear life, can't answer. This is the challenge question of the West in particular, and America, or the West in general, and America in particular right now. How do you stay with one person for 45 years and still have romance? Because what everybody seems to want in survey after survey after survey, from Cosmo all the way to, the Gallup organization, what everybody seems to want is that ideal. Everybody seems to want that ideal, but no one has a clue how to get it.
I'm only 34. So
Yeah.
I like thinking about this. I wonder my proposed answer. I know nobody has the answer, but
nobody knows.
So I've been with my husband for almost 20 years now. We haven't been married that long, but something that I wonder is if the answer is growth.
Okay.
Just keep growing as a person. And I know people think, they look at that, they'll be like, oh, we've grown apart. That's the most like common use of that word in terms of in the context of relationships. Like, we've grown apart. I just don't love him anymore. But if you both keep growing and you both keep your intentionality of like building this relationship, strengthening the relationship, you just kind of keep finding new reasons to fall in love. You can also find reasons to fall out of love,
for sure,
and grow apart. You can do both. I think both paths are available. But that was what popped into my head. Keep growing as a person, because I am, like you said earlier, like if you haven't grown in 30 years, or if you're the same person you were 30 years ago, you haven't grown. Like, you don't want to be the same person that you were when you started the marriage. And the person that you are now, if your husband is the same person, then that might be where that discrepancy is. Maybe. I don't know. I just like, that was the thing that popped into my head. It was like, oh, I wonder if growth is a factor. So just keep finding reasons to grow as a person and grow closer together. I wonder.
Yeah, and again, I'm saying I don't know what the answer is. This is one of those areas where I think the questions are a bottomless pit. And yes, I want you to have that
Sure.
image in your head. It's a bottomless pit of questions because, and I'll use an example here. I once had a business conversation with somebody, interestingly enough, on a networking platform, which I won't say the name of. And it was during the business day. And we were having this conversation. And I don't remember how we got into this. It was a 45-minute long sort of interaction. And she was talking about how her and her partner, which, by the way, anybody who uses that term in the modern context, I'm like, oh, my radar starts to go up. The back little thing in the back of my head goes up. Because I don't know where they're going right with this.
Right.
I don't know if that means they're cohabitating. I don't know if that means they're cohabitating in the same sex, relationship. I have no clue. So now my radar
Yeah.
goes,
Yep.
okay, what are we
Yep.
talking about here? And she says her and her partner have decided not to get married. And they've been together for almost the same amount of time that you've been with your husband, right? 20 years. And she said it works for us. I wouldn't recommend it for other people. And I thought, that's an
That's
incredible insight. That's incredible insight. Because what we say very often is, I've been married for X number of years, or I've been with this person for ABC number of years. And then we go around using shoulds after that. You should,
sure.
we should, he, she, or it should. Now, is there an ideal? Yes, there is an ideal.
I was going to say, because you could go around interviewing. I'm sure it's been done. Like, there's got to be through lines of the people
Oh, yeah.
who have been married for forever and still have romance. Like, they have to exist.
Oh,
And
yeah,
they have
absolutely. Oh,
the
absolutely.
information has to be out there. This is the information age. It exists.
Oh, yeah. You can actually, weirdly and interestingly enough, you can go to the the National Research Council. They have a ton of graphs, and I did some of that looking into for this particular podcast. They have a ton of graphs on divorce rates, marriage rates, cohabitation rates, same-sex marriage rates, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian. Like, they break it all down, and they've got graphs and charts. It's great. You can go look at the National Research Council and find out all of this information, more data than you could possibly know. And
yeah, but I'm talking about like qualitative data.
right. And this is my point. And yet, when you dig into the bottomless pit of data, you have to find individuals. And the point that she was making, and this is why I thought it was a good insight, is when someone decides to break from the ideal, in general, what we do in our culture, and this is a lesson for leaders, in general, what we do in our culture is we say, well, my break from the ideal should be the thing that everybody else does. And so let's go mold state policy so that it will be the ideal, because it worked for me, and I see all this other dysfunction. So it must be something that I must have the solution. I must have the silver bullet that everybody else needs in order to solve this problem. When in reality, what she was saying was, and she didn't really know this, what she was saying was, the ideal didn't work for me, and so I found a compromise, but I don't want this to go to scale for everybody else. That's incredibly insightful. That's maturity. That's looking at, forget romance and love, that's looking at the specifics of their situation and saying, we figured out our negotiation around this. Do what you want. And while I may not agree with that, because I want people to pursue an ideal,
Right.
I do. I want people to pursue an ideal. I'm a partisan for an ideal. If you can't get there from here, to be intellectually and more morally honest with yourself about that, and with the other person that you're engaged with, to me is hugely important. And that's another failure of our time. We don't have people who are intellectually and morally honest with themselves or with the other party that they're involved with.
Right.
So, okay. We're going to talk about marriage here in just a second.
Is it possible to take a very small break?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can pause right here. Yeah. Absolutely.
We'll perfect.
Pause right here. We'll put a cut right here.
I will be right back.
Yeah. We'll pause right here and you'll come right back. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. All right, yeah, we're back from break. That's good. All right, we'll actually put an ad right there. That's what we'll do.
Perfect.
Actually, we put an ad right there. So there we go. Yeah, back to the sonnets. Back to the Folger Shakespeare Library edition of the Sonnets by William Shakespeare. We're going to turn the corner here. We're going to talk a little bit more about marriage, but then we're going to get into sort of some solutions to problems and how can you be a romantic, right, in our culture today? Because I think there's romance, there's love, and then there's being a romantic, which is a totally different kind of thing. All right. We're going to pick up here with Sonnet 116. And I quote, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds or bends with a remover to remove. Oh, no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved." Close quote. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Interesting. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. Interesting. And the point here, I think, that Shakespeare is trying to make is this. And let's talk a little bit about marriage. So the practical container, one of the many containers that we decide we're going to cram love and romance into in our, and I'm only going to talk about our American culture. If you are listening to this in another country, we have fans globally. So if you were listening to this in another country, just know I'm speaking out of an American context, and you can see all of our dirty laundry live on TikTok and YouTube. So you know what's going on, because that's where we put it. Oh, we do. We do a really good job of exporting our dirty laundry to literally everywhere. There's no one who does not know what is going on here.
All in the name of authenticity.
Oh my gosh, and transparency. Yes.
There,
yes, yes, ma'am. So, in case you didn't know, in other countries, 44% of millennials, 53% of Gen Xers, and 61% of boomers are married as of 2020. Now, there was an interesting thing that happened during 2020 called COVID. And during that time, divorce rates actually spiked because of lockdowns. I fundamentally believe because of lockdowns, and people couldn't leave to go to work. And I do think that absence makes the heart grow fonder in weird kinds of ways. And then when people were locked down and could not be absent, marriages fell apart. And by the way, the most famous example of this is Bill and Melinda Gates, who were in a 6,000 square foot home in Seattle and couldn't stay married. There just wasn't enough space between Bill and Melinda. I'll leave you to wrap your brain around that one as Kristen's mouth just drops open. Oh, it wasn't the Epstein Island thing. It wasn't that. It wasn't it wasn't, she didn't have a problem with any of that. It was the lockdown that killed that marriage. Now, the longstanding 6,000 square foot.
I'm trying to think of how big the apartment that I was stuck in with 3 other men, one of which was my husband.
Sure.
One
Back
of
in the
which was
early
living
days.
in the living room. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
have any space. And I like, if my friendships and marriage made it through that and she could, what are you gonna
You're hashtag winning. That's all you got to put next to
All
your name.
right, there you
Hashtag winning.
go. We did it.
We did it. Yeah. Um, there's a longstanding idea about marriage rates that 50% of them end in divorce. And that's not actually proven out by the numbers. And people, by the way, from Bill Maher, famous people from Bill Maher, all the way to academicians and professors who you've never heard of, make this claim. And have, by the way, been making this claim culturally since the 1970s. Now, the reality is that among people who are working class, poor, and increasingly middle class, yes, divorce rates up until the point of the 2020s were up, particularly through the 1990s. But guess what? If you make more than, I believe, combined, it's like $75,000 a year. If you make more than that, you're not getting divorced, which tells me something, by the way, about marriage. Marriage is still about property, not primarily, or maybe even almost exclusively, about love. Now, yes, people do split up. People do. I mean, I've known people who have gotten divorced in my life for what I think might be the thinnest of reasons. Um, and there has been a rise. I would be remiss if I didn't say this on this podcast because everybody can see it around them in cohabitating and dating, particularly long-term cohabitating and long-term dating, even without cohabitating. And I think personally, and this is just my opinion, not the opinion of the place where I got the statistics from, which by the way was the National Research Council. You can go look them up yourself. I think the cohabitating and dating are far stronger drivers for reduced marriage rates in America than anything else. And again, I have no numbers on this. I merely have observations of note. And I'm sure that I could find some numbers that would bear these observations out. There's another factor that has occurred, which has opened up options, and that's the factor of technology. Um, and this has opened up options for both men and women in the world. And you combine the availability of individuals who want to titillate, both men and women, as well as, I believe, fundamentally, and this is an unpopular opinion, but it is an opinion that I hold. Nonetheless, I do believe that the opening up of workplaces to women and the integration of spaces that were formerly, quote unquote, men only has also driven some of this. Now, my more feminist listeners, both men and women, will object, and that's fine. We can have that discussion. But I do believe that it is a factor that, putting all emotion aside, we do have to admit has done something. It's not a value neutral fact. It's not a value neutral advancement. Particularly if we're going to claim that technology has done all these things, we have to look at all the human factors as well. So I do think those areas have contributed to how we think about marriage and divorce in the 21st century and the milieu that we are in, which we just came off of discussing before the break, where love we would like to have as a primary driver, but then there's all this other stuff. There's all these other things. And I'm going to use myself as an example. Actually, no, I won't use myself as an example. I'll use a couple I know. So they were married. They got divorced. And the biggest impediment to the divorce in the state that I live in was how the property was going to be divided, specifically the home, and who was going to get most of the profit from the home sale. That was the biggest impediment. And by the way, that's not unusual. Didn't stop them from getting divorced, though. So, how does this relate to leaders? Because I know all of you who are listening to this have been listening for an hour and you're like, okay, the sonnets, love poems, marriage, romance. Got it. Hey, son. Okay. Can we get to something on the other side of the break here? Yes, let's get to something on the other side of the break here. When leaders are leading in workplaces, if the marriage rates are to be believed, at least 44% of their millennial staff, the millennial age staff, will be married. But at least 60% of them will not be. They'll be in some sort of cohabitating dating relationship. 53% of Gen Xers will be married. but somewhere around 40 some odd 47% of them will not be. And then 61% of boomers will be married, and they will probably be working on their second or third marriages, but they are retiring out of the system and out of the team. If I am leading a team of Gen Xers and millennials, which more likely I will be, right, and Gen Zers who will not be married, by the way, they will be primarily cohabitating and dating, and they come to me with the state of their personal relationships, which they will, because we are now transparent about everything. What do I do about that as a business leader? And by the way, I just saw a story the other day, just to layer on one more thing. I saw a story the other day on LinkedIn about how organizations are now hiring coaches and mentors to get Gen Zs to be more loyal, people in the Gen Z generation to be more loyal to workplaces. And by the way, if I'm coaching or mentoring, what am I going to be talking about? It ain't going to be all about work. Thoughts? Because this is a real problem for modern leaders. Boomers never talked about any of this stuff ever. They thought it was all private over there. Don't talk to me about any of it ever. But what we've seen, because of technology, because of cultural changes, we are now seeing a sea shift, and leaders have to address people's personal relationships. And this makes leaders, particularly leaders of a certain generation, extremely uncomfortable.
Mm.
And I get this question quite a bit. Matter of fact, I actually got it last week when I was working with a client, a variation of this question. So I'm going to ask you, Christen. Go ahead.
Well, as someone who's been working as a freelancer entrepreneur for 12 years now, which, is and isn't a lot, depending on how you look at it. But one of the things that you have to figure out as a freelancer is and I have a coach, is how to process and be mentally and emotionally healthy with all the personal stuff going on, and still show up for your business, because if you don't, no one else will, because you are the business, right? So part of me is like, if I can do it, so can the bosses. Be a boss, care about someone else, have a heart. Because that's the thing, right? I think there's a lot of language out there in what is it, the hustle culture,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
That's like, lock down the feelings, shut up, show up, shut up and show up. That didn't work for me.
Right.
That was a recipe for disaster. It led to a lot of burnout, kind of recurrences of depression. It's just like, oh, I'm regressing. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
But so there is, I think there's a both and here, right? So if, you're a leader and you're running a business, then have the resources for them to care for your people. Like, care about your people, their lives, but so that they can get back to work. Because that I think that has to be the boundary, or not the boundary, the balance. Because it's like, hey, we're not just friends. We're not friends, actually. I'm your boss. And while I do care about you, get back to work. And the trend that I'm seeing is almost like you can't fire people anymore, because anything, like, if they're not showing up, oh, it's because my boyfriend broke up with me. And I was like, well, but you're still not doing your job. It's like, oh, but if you fire me, it's because I'm, I don't know, it's a personal attack on me. I'm like, no, not that either. You just you're not doing your job. So I don't know if I have like practicals. Do ABC. I don't, but that's
the overall strategy.
That's the word vomit.
Yeah, that's the word vomit.
There you go.
There's the word vomit. Find something in there.
Right.
Well, here's the pushback on this. I think of and it is floating around Instagram Reels, and I see it occasionally, not as often as I used to, but I see it occasionally in the last year. When I dip into Instagram and then dip out again.
My Instagram is all about Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't see anything else.
You don't see anything else? Okay, great.
It's great. The D&D memes are the best.
So the real clip that I see is the one from Mad Men where Don Draper is yelling at the female individual or whatever, and she's like, "You don't say thank you for any of my ideas," and he's like, "The money is the thank you. Like you're young, you should just take the money. Your ideas will be honored at a certain point, but just
Mm,
take the money and get out." Now, that's very much a boomer attitude, by the way. That's very
yeah,
much a boomer attitude. The money is the thank you. The
sure.
money is the thing I pay you in lieu of having a relationship with you. And so the pushback on that is, and this is the pushback, and it is legitimate. Here's a legitimate pushback. Inflation is at 2.9% in the country. Groceries that used to cost me, 400 bucks a month now cost me 800 bucks a month.
Yep.
The money isn't the thank you anymore. If I'm going to keep showing up for your BS job where you're only paying me 15 bucks an hour and I'm scraping by and you want me to be grateful for that, there's a word that I could say and you're not going to fire me because you can't get anybody else. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to care. And by the way, you will be made to care. You will be made to bend. I'm not the organization. That's a different thing. I will make you manager, you supervisor bend. And I'm going to make you bend by just diluting you with my personal problems because I can't give it to I was raised by parents who allowed me to delude them with personal problems, and they solved many of them. And now you've stepped in, paterfamilias, because you're paying me. Well, paying me means your mom and dad now. That's the pushback.
Ooh, fascinating.
That's that's the sociological, I think, the sociological pushback to your assertion. Now, do I think that everybody within a particular generational cohort believes that? No, there's individuals. Give me a break. There's something like 85 million millennials, and there's something like 65 or 70 million Gen Zers. Like it's insane. There's too many individuals inside of those two group cohorts for it to be everybody, right? However, there is a media driven, potentially, idea that the Industrial Revolution boss boomer is the greatest thing to be overcome. And the only way that you can overcome that is through a deluge of feelings.
Hmm.
By the way, this is where you
Why
get,
are we overcoming the boss?
well,
Like, what does that mean?
because the boss is the avatar for the man. You know how in the 60s and 70s boomers
Yes.
used to talk when they were young, they talked about the man.
Yep.
We've bumped out the man for corporations. We've bumped out the man for big pharmaceutical companies. We've bumped out the man for climate change. We've bumped out the man for all these other things that stand in for the man. But it's the same idea. There's this system that has to be overcome.
Yeah.
And so we have to use tools to overcome it so that the glorious revolution can come that we as the youth believe that we are responsible for bringing forward. Except the problem is there is no glorious revolution and you're all going to get old. Which, by the way, the older millennials now understand this. The ones who are closer, who are in their mid 40s, they now get it. They now get that there's no glorious revolution, and I might want to buy a house. I want to get out of that. I want to get out of that 2-bedroom apartment I'm sharing with 4 people. It
Right.
was cool when I was 35 or 25, even. Sorry,
Yeah.
it was cool when I was 25. But I got to leave now.
Well, but kind of back to your point, like, you were mentioning, that not boomers. I hate that phrase.
I do too, but I'm just using it because it's what everybody
The baby
knows.
boomers, yeah, the baby
Yeah.
boomers are retiring. Something that I don't read, like the news. I don't do any of this. Like
Yeah.
I'm just kind of off in my own little world. And I know people are like, "Boo, you should be informed." Like, well, that's fine.
No, you shouldn't. You're
My
fine.
husband stays informed.
You're doing fine. You're not missing
Yeah.
anything.
Right. And so, well, but one of the things that I keep hearing, and I don't know if this is accurate, is that boomers aren't retiring. And it's harder to find promotions. So it's to your point where like
Mhm.
15 bucks an hour, like
Right.
how with prices skyrocketing, is how are we supposed to buy a house?
Right.
How are we supposed to do this?
which is also where the
Oh, and that's not even talking about student debt, which is
we're
a
not even going to talk about
whole
that.
other
That's a
conversation.
whole other conversation. The challenge that we are seeing for leaders, and it is one that I see articulated when they come to me, is leaders feel as though, and I'm talking about managers and supervisors at the mid-level in organizations,
Mhm.
they feel as though they are already in a deluge between um, demands and pressures placed upon them by the upper echelon folks of the
Mhm.
organization that they can't meet.
Mhm.
And then all of the knock-on effects of COVID, all the bad behavior we opened doors for during the last 2 to 3, I would even argue 4 years, because there's certain bad behaviors that are just continuing,
Mhm.
that are among folks who are below them in the structure. And so they are squeezed in the middle and asked to do an impossible job.
Yeah.
And to compound it, the folks who are rising up from the bottom are not exactly folks that are mentally strong
Right.
in order to deal with the nonsense that's going to occur at that level. And by the way, probably
Yeah.
the most mentally strong generation is the Gen Xers, probably individuals primarily between the ages of 46 and now 64, right? Or 46 and 58, somewhere around there. Who grew up in literal, who have grown up, worked literal last 20 years of chaos. It's just been chaos all the time. And so it's like pressure, it's fizzy water all over their brain all the time. And it's just,
Mhm.
just, it's just how you live, right? This
Mhm.
is just it. Whereas generations subsequent to them, um, the impression is that that pressure is a new thing. This economic pressure is a new
Ah.
thing. And it's
Oh, I see.
not,
I
because people
see.
don't understand history, the cycle
Yes.
thing. People don't understand the cycles of history, much less the cycles of romance. People don't understand
Right.
the cycles of history. And so because they don't understand the cycles of history, they have no anchor point for what this is. Like everything they're
They're
going
like,
through right
life is
now.
hard. It's so much harder now. It's unfair. It's like, no, life is just hard. This
Right.
is just
Well,
a new hard.
right. Like I tell young people that I talk to who are in the 19 to 34-year-old age range, it was just as equally hard to people in the 1970s when inflation was on par with what it is now. But they'll be like, oh, but this thing, this thing, this thing. I'm like, but you're judging it through now's lens.
Right.
If you had to go back to like 1974, it would be just as hard to buy a house then. It's just as hard. And by the way, they were getting paid less. They were getting paid like $2 an hour, 2.50 an hour. Where and a loaf of bread, which used to be 15 cents and was made in like Wisconsin somewhere at some white bread factory, is now what immediately skyrocketed to being a dollar for a loaf of bread, and you're making 2.50 an hour. And you're going to tell me that it was better back then? The whole reason that house values went up is because when you could grab a house, you stayed in it as long as you possibly could. You
Yep.
repaired it as
Yep.
long. You learned those skills that now we all have to learn off of YouTube. And so older leaders who understand this and have historical knowledge are going, I don't know, what's wrong? What are we doing here? Like you're coming to me and you're telling me that you're having you need a mental health day? Why? For what? Like life? which is to your point, if you don't show up because your boyfriend broke up with you, okay, I'm going to go a step deeper here. What does the leader do with the person who is solid? And this is a challenge question. The person who is solid, they show up every day, they've been doing the work, they appear to be solid family people, and then like they show up one day and they're like, I got to move out of my house, I'm getting a divorce. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to need to work more hours. I'm going to need to pick up a second shift because, yeah, this is going to suck. Lawyers and everything. This is going to be terrible. What does a leader do with that?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I don't know.
Right. Well, but
I
you're the
like
person you're the
what
person who's co-hosting today. So
I
I
know.
mean,
It's
hey,
like
there you go.
I've been self-employed my entire life. Like
Right.
what does a leader do with that? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I I would just ask a bunch of questions. We're like, well,
Right.
can you give him more hours? Is that even a possibility? Do you have the coverage? Like sometimes the answer is no, just by the numbers. Like,
Right.
sorry, dude, can I help you get a second job?
Well, and on the female side, now that's the dude side. On the female side, it's my husband's moving out. I've got to go get childcare now.
Mhm.
And I'm going to need to be, I'm not going to need to take on another shift. I can need to do less work so I can go pick up my kids now
Yeah.
because I actually have less coverage. That's the practical consideration on the female side.
Mhm.
of the equation. And I don't know and increasingly we've seen calls from government, not just in this country, in the United States, but all across the world, for paid maternity, paid paternity, these kinds of leave policies. But the leave policies don't actually address what happens in the event of a divorce. They don't actually address that. No nation
Mm.
state currently is even remotely interested in addressing that challenge.
Oh, interesting.
At least none that I'm aware of. Most nation states are desperate to get men and women together to have babies. Please get together and have babies. We don't care whether they're in wedlock, out of wedlock, just have babies. And if you won't have babies, then we'll import people who will. I mean,
Unless you
I hate to
can.
I hate to be that direct, but I mean that's the policy of the World Economic Forum and all those people who go to the Klaus Schwab meetings every quarter. Like that's the policy. If you won't have babies, we'll import people who will. Because
Oh,
we need
your
live
mic.
bodies to work.
Oh, wait, what happened? Okay, you're back now.
Yeah.
That was strange.
Yeah, my mic cut out a little bit.
Yeah.
I bought my mic. Anyway. So we need live bodies. Like we need people who will do the act of increasing our population. Not to be prurient or salacious. We need taxpayers.
Yeah, right.
Because how else are the social programs going to get funded? Where else are we going to get the money from? We can't print our way out of it. The United States tried that. Didn't work. So we can't print our way out of it. So we're going to need more bodies. And by the way, in the United States, we now have an immigrant population. We're not going to talk about how they got here, but we have an immigrant population that is increasing. And that immigrant population does what? They have babies. Most nation states are focused on how to get people to have babies. They don't really care what happens, at least not at a national policy level, from what I'm aware of, what happens when that relationship breaks up. They don't really care about that.
Mm.
And fundamentally, I think that's a blind spot in leadership. By the way, I've been a freelancer. I haven't worked a regular job in like 15 years either, so it's fine.
Right.
But I've
well,
led
this
other,
is your world, so you
right,
like.
but I've led other people, right?
Yeah,
And I've led other people, and I've put teams together. And I have had team members come to me and say, "I need to work fewer hours because I got to go pick up my kid." Or, I'm thinking one particular individual in particular where like he did break up with his girlfriend, and it was a lot of drama for him, and he brought that drama to work.
Yeah, see, that's not that's what can't. I feel like can't be okay. You gotta. Oh, that was you said. I need to work less hours because I have to go pick up the kids. Something that I really admire about a gal that I coached with for a long time. She coached me, and her company. She doesn't like it's the idea that you're the value that you produce is not tied to the hours that you work. So as long as you're doing the thing that I need you to do, I do not care how long it takes you to do it.
Right.
So, and that's how she structures her company. She doesn't pay people like I think, like, obviously, I think she pays everything's above board. She's not doing anything shady or anything, but she talks about paying people for the value of the job that they're doing.
Yep.
Versus, and she's like, I don't care what hours you clock in. So as long as you're doing the stuff that I need you to do. And so that's kind of how I think about that quandary. We're like, well, okay, as long as you get your job done.
Yeah.
I know that's not like a perfect solution, especially for like a lot of our structures right now. People are paid hourly. But I would love to see that's an ideal. And I know we move into that later. The idealistic and romantic, and like ideally romantically, like I would love to see us move away from the hourly, like paid hourly
ideal
structure, format.
Well, and I wonder if part of what I wonder is happening is, or if I wonder let me frame it this way. I think that we are in the cusp of, and I'm not going to use the term fourth industrial revolution because it's used by the World Economic Forum and it implies a whole bunch of different things that I don't think will happen. And some that I do if people in power and organizations in power get their way. But I think underneath there is a core conception that is true. And the core conception is this: the Industrial Revolution that brought us everything that we are looking at, including, by the way, our modes of leadership and our modes of marriage and habitation and family raising, because it's all, even schooling, it's all part of it, that no longer works. And it's not because we aren't getting the same outcomes that we were getting from it previously. It's because those outcomes aren't matching and aren't useful in the reality that we live in. So when I talk about, sometimes I talk about the schooling, right? Why did the kid have to go to school from K through 12 in America and sit in rows and be educated from the sage on the stage at the front of the room? It doesn't make any sense. And so COVID broke open that. And I believe that fundamentally we should have a basket of educational options that people can take advantage of. And the state, quite frankly, should be agnostic about which option a parent picks. Just like, by the way, the state should be agnostic about who the parent marries or doesn't marry or whatever. The state should have zero interest in any of this. But I understand at a taxation level why the state does. And on an educational level, I understand at an ideological level why the state has an interest in that, right? But education is just one area, right? And so we've noted, but we don't have enough, what do you call it? Will, maybe it is, political will, small p political will, to break the structure and go through to the other side, which is part of what's happening, I think, a part of what's building in our time, right? So while you're correct to not look at current events, I believe fundamentally that there are fractures in the system and in the structure that everybody can see, but no one has a clue what is going to look like on the other side of the structure breaking apart. However, there are some people who are proposing ideas like a basket of educational options, or like in healthcare, like why would we go to this one hospital in this one town when I can do this basket of healthcare options, right, that are available to me? Which puts more power, by the way, distributed power in the hands of individuals, less hands in the power of a centralized state, which is why the state pushes against all of this. Okay. When we talk about marriage and child raising, I'm opposed to the state issuing marriage certificates for anybody, by the way. I think marriage certificates should be issued by religious institutions. The religious institutions should be left alone by the state. Be done. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work for same-sex folks. It doesn't work for folks who have more progressive ideologies. It doesn't work for folks that believe in glorious Marxist revolution. It doesn't work for them. And I get it. It doesn't work for you and where you want to, your outcomes and things that you, I get it. I understand it doesn't work for you. Cool. But the state should be neutral on this.
Right.
By the way, the state should also be neutral, or not just should be neutral. The state should be as neutral on this as it is on divorce. Now, if you go and look at divorce laws in various states, divorce laws tend to favor women and children over men because the state steps in the role of protector and provider that a man would traditionally be in. If the state got out of caring about that, I think more men and women would make, I think men and women both would shift in how they make their choices about who to cohabitate, have relations with, have romance with. And I think it would be much more transactional in a way where it's not transactional now. It's sort of a faux romantic kind of thing versus a transactional thing. Because look, if I'm getting married, I should be looking at whoever it is I'm going to be married to, yes, as a person who I can grow with, to your point earlier, who I can grow with and all these kinds of things. By the way, grow with in a practical kind of way across all spectrums of agreement, understanding that that person may grow into something that I might not like. And so I have to be like, okay with that over the long term. And by the way, I may grow into something that they may not like. I have to be practical about this. But if the state is the backstop to me making a bad decision, which, by the way, it is in divorce, and it is in divorce laws, the state's the backstop for women. well, then I can just be romantic because there's no what's the downside? And by the way, this is a very red pill argument. It is. It is a very red pill argument, and the red pill manosphere community will probably be clapping for me and be like, "Hey, you didn't go far enough. Shut up, boys. Sit down." I got problems with you too. You're not making decisions based on romance. You're basing decisions based on sex, which no one wants to talk about that out loud, but that's true. You're making decisions based on how this woman looks, in a tight dress, which is great, except here's the problem. When you get what it is you want to get from that woman and she has a baby, her body ain't going to look like the same way it looked in that tight dress when you first got her. It's just not. And are you willing to live with that? You're not, because you have this weird ideal in your head and the ideal judges you, and the ideal, you stop. So stop it. And so I think if you got the state out of part of that process, what would happen is men and women would adjust naturally. And by the way, it would happen organically. And in 5-10 years, we'd have a totally, completely different system and structure because it'll happen quite quickly. Men and women are going to make those negotiations quite quickly at a very practical level. Women would start withholding sexual favors, for all kinds of different reasons. They would make up the 10,000 reasons women have in their heads for withholding. They would make up all those reasons, and men would make all the reasons for why we got to storm the castle, and history would move on, right? But the state would be agnostic. And by the way, I think if Russia did this, Russia's fertility rate would go up. If Vladimir Putin stopped talking about this and just got the state out of the way.
Does Russia ever get the state out of the way?
Well, this is a challenge, right? This is a challenge for nation states, right? China, perfect example, one-child policy. The state explicitly made a policy about fertility and, quite frankly, in areas even they didn't touch on: marriage, cohabitation, divorce. By making a one-child policy, they made a statement about all those things, and look at how well that worked. They don't even report their population numbers anymore. They'll probably be at 800 million people by the end of this century. Maybe, we think. For what? Because you're trying to prevent overpopulation? You're trying to prevent whatever was going to happen naturally between men and women who could negotiate it, by the way, on their own without the state interrupting. And that's my objection. I do not think the state has an interest in this. Just like I don't think the state has an interest in, or should have an interest in, education or healthcare. All these areas, the state's involved in. Why? Why are you there?
Right.
When people can just negotiate those things independently. So, my word, vomit over.
There you go.
Rant over. Rant over.
Push the box out of the room.
You may all send me, don't bother Kristen, she's the guest. You can send me all your dirty emails at I don't really care to hear your feedback.com. No, it's fine. No. No, please tell me that I'm wrong. Really. I mean, mark it up in LinkedIn, wherever it is you get this podcast. Tell me if you've made it this far. Tell me that I'm wrong. Tell me that I'm this is not correct. Because I think at the root of this is that ideal of romantic love, like we've been talking about with the sonnets, but then it grows into all these other areas because people are trying to scale their experience. And I think it's a real challenge for leaders. Okay. Back to the sonnets. Less of me and more of William Shakespeare. Sonnet 73 from Sonnets by William Shakespeare, from the Folger Shakespeare Library. And I quote, "That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long."
That's a good one.
It's a very good one. being a romantic in a cynical, skeptical, as I just ranted, mechanistic age, surrounded by the results of, and by the way, they are the plentiful results of a scientific materialistic aesthetic, is a real struggle. When we talk about being a romantic, we're typically referencing the culture and ideals of the Romantic period. And the Romantic period in English literature was a direct response, a revolutionary response, such as it were, to the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The Romantic period began in 1798 and continued into, some will say, 1837 or even 1850. And that famously covers a time that encompasses the American Revolution, the British Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution, as well as Napoleon. And it was also a time of the painters like Eugene Delacroix, who painted in a particular kind of way, and the poet William Wordsworth, who wrote in a particular kind of way, and of course, the writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German, who wrote in a particular kind of way. Now, in our time, almost no one is a romantic anymore due to the fact that Romanticism requires a connection to the land as opposed to a connection to technology, a love for the individual rather than a love for the revolution of the masses. For the Romantics, the critic Isaiah Berlin says this, and I quote, "In the realm of ethics, politics, and aesthetics, it was the authenticity and sincerity of the pursuit of inner goals that mattered. This applied equally to individuals and groups, states, nations, movements. This is most evident in the aesthetics of Romanticism, where the notion of eternal models, a Platonic vision of ideal beauty, which the artist seeks to convey, however imperfectly on canvas or in sound, is replaced by a passionate belief in spiritual freedom and individual creativity. The painter, the poet, the composer do not hold up a mirror to nature, however ideal, but invent. They do not imitate the doctrine of mimesis, but create not merely the means, but the goals that they pursue. These goals represent the self-expression of the artist's own unique inner vision to set aside, which, in response to the demands of some external voice, like the church, the state, the public opinion, family, friends, or even those arbiters of taste, is an act of betrayal of what alone justifies their existence for those who are in any sense creative." Close quote. But Berlin also notes in his essay from which I pulled that quote that in the 20th century, the Marxist revolutions, Hitler and fascism, and of course, all of the communist revolutions that killed almost 100 million people in the very bloody 20th century knocked the hell out of the innocence of the Romantics. And of course, the moral and political power of Romanticism has declined precipitously over the last 100 years. I would assert that in our era, it might be time to resurrect the power of the Romantics yet again, where the artist seeks to convey, however imperfectly on canvas or in sound, a passionate belief in spiritual freedom and individual creativity. I think at the end of the fourth turning, where we are surrounded by the benefits of technology. I mean, heck, look at this podcast, right? I would not be talking to you without mechanistic engineering technology. And I think that artificial intelligence is going to prove that we've kind of hit dead end on some of this. Not to say there won't be technological wonders on the other side. There will be, because people are creative, but I think we've currently hit a dead end. Peter Thiel, the investor, invested in Facebook and owns Palantir, and who also was part of the PayPal mafia, along with Elon Musk and Reid Hoffman, infamously has said, and I'm going to rough quote this, "We were promised houses on the moon and vacations to Mars, and instead we got Facebook and tweeting in 280 characters. A mechanistic mind gives you tweeting in 280 characters. A romantic mind gets you to Mars, no matter how mechanistic that mind may be." So I would argue that Elon is probably a romantic. By the way, he's got 12 kids and 4 marriages, I think, and 5 relationships under his belt. So, I mean, he's doing his job. He's doing his part for
I'm doing my part.
increasing the population of the country. He's doing his part. But I think we need to resurrect the ideals of Romanticism. I think we need to set aside the demands of the external voice, church, state, public opinion, family, friends, arbiters of taste, in exchange for a perception of, not even perception, a pursuit of quality first, a romantic pursuit of quality. Not idealistic, not in a John Lennon kind of imagine there's no heaven kind of way, which by the way is a terrible song. But it's terrible. Everybody knows it's terrible. Come on now. But but I think we need to set it. I think we need to pursue quality in opposition to a merely mechanical mind, a merely evolutionarily driven, AI produced automaton vision of the future, which I think a lot of people want to push us towards. As we close here, because it's time for me to let Christen go. She's been with me long enough today. How can romantics operate in our mechanistic time? And I ask you this as a writer specifically. That's kind of why I came up with this question here for you.
Well, I have been thinking about the definitions. Like how are you defining romantic? Because you did just distinguish it between romantic and ideal, or just you did just make the distinction between romantic and ideal. So I'm trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a romantic?
Well, I think to be a romantic is to acknowledge that there are eternal models, right? And I think that there are. I think it is also to acknowledge and to pursue quality. I think that is a romantic pursuit, and not quality in sort of a mechanistic conception of quality, but quality in terms of we are pursuing a platonic vision of an ideal, a platonic ideal of beauty, or a platonic idea of capital T truth. And we're going to do that with spiritual freedom and with individual creativity, in direct opposition to a mechanistic framework. And we're going to do this ruthlessly. And we're going to do it with a smile on our face. Or maybe we're going to do it frowning. It doesn't matter. But we're going to do it ruthlessly. And by the way, I think there are romantics in our time. I think we've got, or people who have a romantic bent in our time. So I mentioned Elon Musk already. I think Jordan Peterson is probably a romantic. I think that, weirdly enough, the writer Jack Carr is a romantic. I think that as far as directors go, like if we're talking about film directors, you'd be hard pressed to find a romantic film director in our time. I think Christopher Nolan is probably about as close as we're going to get right now.
Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah, he just doesn't do enough work. But yeah, I would throw Del Toro in there. He just doesn't. He just doesn't do enough work, you know? I mean, you're bundling around with Pinocchio on Netflix. Like, what are we doing?
Did you watch that?
So I've seen the trailer for it, and I kind of go, well, okay. I mean, I see what you're doing.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. Okay.
It's amazing.
Okay.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. Okay. All right.
I loved it. I
will take it up on your recommendation.
Yeah.
But I also see it in Craftsman. So there's this show I watch on on HBO Max, which comes through either TLC or the Discovery Channel, whichever property they own, called Restoration Road, where this guy named Clint Harp, and it was on for about 5 seasons, where basically he goes around the country working with people who are trying to restore barns and restore old buildings, right? And literally taking them out of the Northeast. Like he'll take a barn out of upstate New York, where I used to live, where they don't care about it. It's just rotting in a field somewhere because it doesn't fit the mechanistic mentality of our current time. And then he takes that to like Idaho and turns into a cheese factory where people are being taught how to make cheese and do weaving and do, handcrafts and all these kind of amazing things. And he does this repeatedly. He found 5 years of content, on this. And it's not just barns, it's also silos and things like that. And he's getting into the history and he's understands that. And you can tell when he shows up that he cares about the Platonic vision and the ideal of truth, and his carpentry skills that he brings to the game are secondary to pursuing that with quality. That's what I'm talking about as being those are people who I believe are romantics. Those are examples that I would that I would call on in our time.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you operate? How do we get
do
more of that and not less of that? How do we get more of that? That's really the question. How do we get more of that? How do we squeeze more of that juice out of the body politic? Because I think we need more of it.
Yeah. Well, uh, my brain just went all the way back to like child formation, school. You just have to completely change the format of school because right now, like, what gets pushed in school?
Oh,
Math,
nonsense.
science, that's physics,
But even
engineering.
there, it's
Like,
not good STEM. It's the most basic level STEM stuff because
I
what
don't
we're
know. Kids
dealing
are doing calculus before high school now. It's just like, what? But why?
they're doing calculus before high school so they can think like computers. But they're not being taught literature in high school. That's
Well, they're
vanishing.
trying. Yes, it is. It is. It is. And so, yeah, start there. But that doesn't really answer the question. That's like long term, right?
Right.
You have to shift things when children are forming. But how like romantics, because I consider myself a romantic.
Mm-hmm.
And how do my first thought was well, I have to have my needs met first.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so it's kind of like, well, how do you do that without forcing yourself into the utilitarian mechanistic system?
Mm-hmm.
That is one of those questions. I think the answers will be different for everybody. I
Mm-hmm.
think I've said this before on the podcast. I feel like I kind of got lucky where like
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple, I've, multi-passionate, like I'm a classically trained musician
Mm-hmm.
and I can travel
Mm-hmm.
pretty closely to a fairly affluent neighborhood and teach private music lessons there.
But wait a minute.
And
Wait
that
a
doesn't take a whole lot of time. So now I can
minute.
work part-time for a pretty full-time income. And
But
then
let me push back on that a little bit though. I don't think that's luck. I think that's a series of tiny decisions that you made based on your talent, skills, and competencies that I couldn't have made. If I
that's
tried to make
fair.
those exact same decisions, I would not have wound up in the same clearing at the end of the path that you wound up at. Just like if you had made the same decisions that I had made, you would not have wound up here. There's just no way. We're different people. So what people call luck or what people call fortune, I really think we need to use an older term, and it is a religious term. It's a term the Romantics liked, particularly the American Romantics, providence.
Mm.
It's this idea that there is this entire superstructure called God that cares about who you are at an individual level, at a microscopic decision-making level, and is pushing you, and or in some cases you are allowing yourself to be taken down a particular path that's going to wind you up at a particular clearing, but no one else can go on that river other than you. The guy across the street can't. And by the way, it's brutal because the guy across the street might be homeless. He missed his river. And we can have compassion for him and we can want to feed him and take care of him. And Jesus said, the poor you will have with you always, which is a brutal truth, by the way, that no modern nation state wants to hear. But that person rode down the particular river they were on and they wound up in a clearing at the end of the path. There's no guarantee that you would have wound up there either. So we call it luck. I would push back on the luck piece. I
No,
don't think it's
that's fine.
luck.
That's fair. That's just usually it's like the easiest turn of phrase. Be like,
Sure.
through all of this craziness,
Sure.
I never would have guessed that this is where. And now I'm like, so kind of to your point about being a romantic. Back in November, I purchased the music store that
Mm-hmm.
I teach out of,
Mm-hmm.
and the model that store runs on is not. Was it mechanistic? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's in terms of profit, it's a terrible idea. And
Right.
when we were trying to raise money to preserve that model, everybody kept calling in. They were like, you have to change your model. You have to change your model. And we were like, no, we're not going to do this because this model, romantic, ideal, whatever, like this model serves music education the best. So we're going to figure out a way to preserve it. So I think it's like sorry, the phrase both and comes to mind again,
Mhm.
because like we don't like we are adjusting our model in
Mhm.
that we are taking ideas that people suggested to create revenue in a different area so that we can support and keep the model that supports our teachers, our music teachers, and therefore our music students, and therefore our entire community so
Mhm.
well. So
So
there's
that's a
just
romantic
it's
vision. That's a romantic vision.
100%, because the other like the suggestion that we got was turn all of your teachers into W-2 and pay them less. And I was like, what? I wouldn't have like I wouldn't be at this store
Mhm.
if that's if that's why if that's how the store operated. So like we're not doing that.
Right.
But that is the best way to like, or not best way, sorry. Some would say that that's the easiest, most
Mhm.
efficient way of getting to higher revenue, of making the business more sustainable.
Well, and part of what the Romantics historically between 1798 and 1837 did, right around 1848, 1850, what they were pushing back against was capitalism. They were pushing back on the growing
Right.
accumulation of capital via industrialized mass. And the response that you're getting is the hangover from that ideal.
Right.
The problem is on the other side of the Industrial Revolution that we all now live in, we've gotten to the edges of that model. We financialized all the way out to the edges of that model. This is why when MBAs run Boeing Airlines, engines fall out of planes in the sky and you can't get astronauts back from where you put them on a space station. This is why, because the MBAs are running things and they financialized out the system, the organization, all the way out to the end to drain the last piece of capital from it for shareholders or for executives or whoever, or even for just regular people. And by the way, people like to bag on executives. Usually those executive compensations are usually stock options, usually not salary. And by the way, most everybody else's salary in the organization also goes up. Yes, not as much as the CEOs, but also goes up every time the stock price goes up. So I don't want to hear about it. But please, it's everybody in the ship together. Okay. But they financialize all the way out to the nearest to the nth degree. And a romantic view says we can leave something on the table.
Yeah.
That's okay.
But, and as you were talking, what came to mind was like, what is the point of accumulating all of that? Like, people literally have more money than they can spend.
Right.
And it's not us, but it doesn't matter. Like,
No,
I
no.
think part of clinging to the romantic view is realizing that before you scrape and fight to get there, and you realize this wasn't worth it.
Right.
Like, what am I going to do with the resources that I have now, and like the training in my brain, and like what value can I give to people? What's meaningful to me? So maybe that's a decent answer. Like take the time to slow down, go walk on a beach or in a forest or next to a river. Because I go to the beach once a week at
Mm-hmm.
least, just to walk
Mm-hmm.
and listen and pray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And I get lots of ideas.
See, that's part of riding that river that the transcendent is sending you down. It's providence, not luck. And so
and
that providence is carrying you to the next thing too.
and I think I can hear the cynics being like, I
Oh
don't
yeah.
have time. Like I have to work. I am so exhausted. And I'm like, I was there too.
Mm-hmm.
So the hard part is, doing all the math, making sure, your bills are paid, or crashing with mom and dad for a while,
Mm-hmm.
because we did that.
Mm-hmm.
Just it's kind of doing what you have to do to get to what's worth doing.
Well, and what does doing with less look like? Does
Yeah.
doing with less look like does doing with less so you can homeschool your children look like, all the weight of making money falls on one person and that other person takes on all of the weight of the other pieces of running the household? period, full stop, period. And there's no resentment, by the way, in that. There's no room for resentment in that, because what is happening is occurring at a particular quality level that could not have occurred in order to pursue a platonic vision of truth to educate the next generation. Most people think that, and I think this is a tragedy. I think many people, not I think most, many people, I believe, are operating on the idea that a child's decisions that they make when they're 19 and 20 are a reflection on them as a parent.
Mm.
And the reality is the decisions they're making at 19 and 20, after you've dumped $375,000 for a year, every year for 20 years into them, the reality is, and by the way, that's at the top level. Like, you can raise a child on not $375,000 a year. Like, please give me a break. But if you've done that, if you've bought into that idea, then the decisions that they make are a return on your investment. But the reality is, the decisions that they make have nothing to do with you. And the romantic ideal, which, by the way, is very practical, not soft, the practical romantic idea is, we will, for less than $375,000 a year, put into this child the ability to make decisions that will impact the third and fourth generation down, rather than worrying about how much money we're making or not making right now. Because this is temporary and we are temporary and we will not be here forever. We have to continue somehow. That's a romantic aesthetic that now we can link back to practical considerations of marriage. Who do I marry that's going to have the same aesthetic as I do? And if that person doesn't have the same aesthetic, which, by the way, I should probably be asking this by them on like date number 3, and after date number 3 probably should be like, move on. If their that aesthetic isn't matching, then I'm not going to be engaged in the immediate hedonistic gratification of my base desires. And we all know what that is. Instead, we're going to wait till we actually have some meaningful connection on all of these levels. Whether or not the state agrees with us is irrelevant. We're going to have some meaningful connection on all these levels because we're actually in charge of creating the future state, not the current state that the state is in. But that's a romantic ideal applied to marriage and family and childbearing and all of this. So with that, Christen, do you have anything you'd like to promote today on the podcast? I know you're working on a book.
We are
grinding towards the end of it. What would you like to say about that? And of course, we would love to have you back on. I said this last episode, I'll say it again this episode. We would love to have you back on when you have the book and talk all about that, the process, and how all that came together. And so tell us where we're at with the book and what's happening with that. Give us an update.
If you liked the conversation on romantic love or love in general, the novels that we're working on right now is a trilogy, and it is a romance. So we explore a lot. I've had lots of thoughts about relationships and love. And so I think it's very interesting and very different. It's very different for a romance because I think a lot of romances focus on the will they, won't they. And then kind of a spoiler, we ditch the will they, won't they. Not halfway through really, but like by book 3, it's like, no, we're into like, hey, how do you make two very different people who have fallen in love? Like, how do they make their relationship work? So it's just been so much fun to explore that psychologically. It is fantasy though. I will say I grew up reading fantasy. I love fantasy. I play D&D. So if you like that sort of thing, we are posting our chapters. They are the rough drafts, but if you would like to check them out and just see, hey, do I like this? Please let us know. Also, be like, this chapter sucks. We're like, cool. Why? Why does it suck? Please tell us. We are at World of Urda. So World of Urda is urda.com. And we're also, I apologize for the state of our website. We're trying to update it. I threw it together a couple years ago, and now I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so bad.
Our websites can be updated. I might have a web guy for you.
Yeah. So
websites can be updated.
We do need to update our website, but the the chapters are there. That's probably the easiest place to go find them, unless you're on like Wattpad, which who's on Wattpad?
Not I.
There's a lot of people on Wattpad, but probably not your audience.
They're probably not. No, they don't even know what Wattpad is.
No.
That's okay. That's all right. I know what Wattpad
Yeah.
is, and I'm not even on there. So
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, we will post a link to World of Urda. Right?
Yes.
Did I say that correctly? Awesome.
Yep.
World
I mean,
of
I
Urda.
think I put like a German pronunciation on Uda, but it's
Urda.
fine. Yeah, Urda.
Okay.
My co-author says Urda. It's fine.
Urda.
I cringe a little
We'll
bit.
have a link to where you can find
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
We'll a link in the show notes where you can go check out all the chapters of her new book. And of course, when she has her book out, we will invite her back to talk about her book and the writing process, because I'm fascinated by all of that. And I think that you all should be fascinated by that too. And so, well, with that, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.